Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 17 minutes before he discovered the woman kneeling on his cafeteria floor had once commanded combat evacuations under mortar fire. The ICU at Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah smells of antiseptic and floor wax, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in glass. Danielle Ross moves through her shift with the kind of invisibility that comes from practice, scrubs pressed sharp, hands steady as surgical instruments, her presence felt only in the small adjustments she makes to 4 lines and monitor readings. She has a slight limp in her left leg, barely noticeable unless you watch her navigate the long corridors from room 3 to room 7 to the supply station and back again. The limp is old. The boots in her locker are older still, laced combat issue with salt stains from a desert that no longer exists on any map she's allowed to reference. She doesn't tell anyone about the boots. Room 7 holds a 62-year-old Navy Admiral, unconscious for the past 4 days following a massive stroke. His name is Garrett Hayes. 3 years ago, he stood in full-dress blues at Naval Station Norfolk and pinned a Navy Commendation Medal on Danielle's son before the boy's first deployment. She remembers his eyes, sharp, assessing, the kind of eyes that had seen command and consequence. She remembers him saying to her son, "Your mother must be proud." The boy had nodded. He had no idea that his mother had spent the previous 18 months erased, her last operation classified so far above his clearance level that even now, 3 years later, she could never tell him where she'd been or what she'd done in Marja. Now that Admiral lies in a hospital bed, and Danielle checks his pupils with a penlight every 2 hours. She's been a nurse for 12 years. Before that, she was something else entirely. That life ended in a Pentagon briefing room with a man in a suit who said the words "You're erased" with the finality of a door slamming. Master Chief. Gone. Danielle Ross, RN, appeared in her place, a new social security number, a new name, a new life where she wore scrubs instead of combat gear and saved people in hallways instead of on rooftops. The transition had taken 4 months. Her hands know how to do 17 different types of life-saving procedures that she will never perform in Cedar Creek Medical. Her hands know how to treat sucking chest wounds, how to perform a pericardiocentesis on a patient in hemorrhagic shock while mortar rounds shake the tent, how to establish an emergency airway using nothing but a pen and her muscle memory. Those hands now adjust a saline drip with the same precision they once used to clear a building with an M4 and night vision goggles. She documents the Admiral's neurological status at 6:44 a.m. during night shift, pupils reactive, strength intact, baseline stable. The note is clinical, brief. 3 months of observations in 3 lines. She's meticulous. Documentation is the difference between lawsuits and protection. Dr. Richard Whitfield arrives for morning rounds at 7:15 a.m. with his entourage of residents, 5 young doctors in white coats, 5 sets of eyes that look at her the same way Whitfield does, as background noise, as infrastructure, as something useful only when it performs its function. Whitfield is 58 years old and carries himself like a man who has never been questioned. Expensive watch. Tailored shirt beneath the coat. Wedding ring that catches the fluorescent light. He's been chief of medicine at Cedar Creek for 9 years. His father was a surgeon. His grandfather was a surgeon. The Whitfield name appears on the hospital's endocrinology wing. Danielle stands quietly at the Admiral's bedside while Whitfield reviews the chart. She's positioned herself where she can monitor the bed and maintain sight lines to the door, old habit, tactical positioning, invisible to everyone but herself. Vital stable overnight, Whitfield says to the residents, not looking at the chart's author. No complications. Stroke protocol continuing. He flips pages. His voice has the texture of someone used to being listened to without question. We'll reduce neuro checks to every 4 hours. No need for the hourly assessments anymore. He's stable. This isn't an emergency ward. Danielle doesn't move. Her eyes stay on the Admiral's face. She waits exactly 3 seconds, not rushing, not hesitant, the timing of someone confident in what she knows. Then she speaks, her voice quiet, almost conversational. Pupil showed asymmetry an hour ago. The room shifts. The residents glance at each other. Whitfield's hand freezes on the page he was turning. "Excuse me." His voice has gone cold in the way that powerful men make cold, not heated, just absolute, the tone of someone not accustomed to being corrected by nursing staff. Left pupil slightly more dilated than right. 2 millimeters difference. Noted at 5:13 a.m. It resolved within 15 minutes, but the occurrence is new. Danielle's voice is steady. Clinical. The voice of someone reporting facts, not opinions. Asymmetry can indicate increased intracranial pressure. Might warrant continued neuromonitoring at current intervals. Whitfield's jaw tightens. She watches it happen, the compression of his face, the tightness at his temples, the moment when his brain registers that a nurse has just contradicted his clinical decision in front of his residents. He sets the chart down slowly. Very slowly. His hand is steady, but his eyes have changed. She knows this look. She's seen it before, not in a hospital, in a different context, in different circumstances, but the fundamental ingredient is the same, a man watching someone smaller challenge his authority. He turns to face her fully. This is the moment where most nurses apologize. Where they soften their voices and frame their concern as a question. Where they make themselves smaller. Danielle waits. "Did I ask for your observation, Nurse Ross?" There it is. Subtle. Not loud. The kind of put down that sounds like a professional question to the residents but carries a message underneath: you are not a peer. You are not qualified to speak. You exist to implement my decisions, not question them. The residents shift their weight. One of them, a second-year resident named Chen, probably early 30s, glances at her with something like sympathy. Danielle's jaw tightens. Just for half a second. Just for the duration of a single breath. Then her expression settles back into professional neutrality. Her shoulders remain level. Her hands stay still at her sides. She doesn't apologize. She doesn't elaborate. She doesn't defend. Instead, she does something much more dangerous. She nods once, accepts his rebuke with the grace of someone who isn't arguing, and steps back from the bedside to give him space. She had no idea, and this is the part that would matter later, the part that Whitfield would never see coming, that her silence was a choice. That her acceptance of his dismissal was strategic. That a woman who had once coordinated 53 combat evacuations across Helmand Province in a 72-hour window didn't need to argue with anyone about anything. She simply moved to the next task. She had learned long ago that the quietest victories are the ones that hurt the most. Whitfield continues his rounds. The residents follow. Dr. Chen pauses for a moment and glances back at Danielle, who is now checking the fall line with the same precise movements she was making before the confrontation occurred. Chen's expression suggests he's registering something, maybe competence, maybe unfair treatment, maybe just the strange feeling of watching someone accept humiliation without breaking. Then he turns and hurries to catch up with Whitfield's group. Danielle stands alone in room 7 with the unconscious Admiral. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song. The ventilator breathes its rhythm. The heart monitor traces its steady pattern across the screen, 96 beats per minute, regular, strong, the electrical whisper of a muscle that is holding on. She adjusts the Admiral's pillow. Checks the forecatheter site for signs of infiltration. Documents the findings in the electronic chart with the same clinical precision she's maintained for 12 years of civilian life. Her hands move through the tasks with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory, the kind of competence that comes from thousands of repetitions. This is what she does now. This is who she is supposed to be. But there's something else under the surface. Something that Whitfield triggered the moment he said her name with that particular inflection. Something that lives in the scar tissue of her left leg and in the boots she keeps wrapped in a plastic bag at the bottom of her locker. Something that remembers what it felt like to be someone other than a nurse. She was finishing her assessment when her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from her son: "Hey Mom, night shift's rough. Call me when you get home." He's 17 now. He doesn't know where she really is most nights. He thinks she's sleeping, recovering from her hospital shifts. He doesn't know that she lies awake until 5 a.m., watching the ceiling, thinking about asymmetrical pupils and dismissive doctors and the particular weight of being invisible. She pockets the phone without responding. The shift still has 7 hours remaining. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part would come 17 minutes later, in the cafeteria, when Danielle would move through the serving line with her tray of eggs and toast and coffee, and Dr. Whitfield would be waiting, and the entire nursing staff would witness what happens when a man decides to make his point publicly. The worst part would be the moment that changed everything, not because of what occurred in that cafeteria, but because of what it would set in motion. For now, Danielle stood at the window of room 7, looking down at Savannah's morning traffic beginning to flow, and she thought about her son pinning his dress blues for his first deployment. She thought about the Admiral's hands, steady and firm, as he placed the medal over the boy's head. She thought about the weight of secrets. She thought about what happens when the people around you have no idea who they're really standing next to. She had been invisible for 3 years. She was very, very good at it. She had no way of knowing that in 17 minutes, something was going to force her to stop. The cafeteria smelled like industrial bleach and overcooked chicken. Danielle was carrying her tray, coffee, salad, nothing substantial, the kind of meal a person eats while thinking about someone else, when Dr. Whitfield appeared with 3 attending physicians in his wake. The room had that particular density that comes before something breaks. "There's our ICU expert," he announced, his voice pitched to carry across 20 staff members. His smile was the smile of a man who had learned that cruelty delivered with charm was indistinguishable from wit. "Tell everyone, sweetheart, which medical school taught you to second-guess attendings?" Danielle didn't answer because the question wasn't meant to be answered. His hand came up in a casual arc, not fast, not aggressive, just a man gesturing while he spoke, and the tray left her hands. Coffee splashed across the linoleum in a brown wave. The ceramic plate shattered with a sound like a small bone breaking. A younger nurse named Sarah gasped. Someone else let out a nervous laugh that died immediately. The room went dead silent. Whitfield pulled her updated charts from under his arm and let them flutter onto the wet floor. Papers scattered like wounded birds. His smile never wavered. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Danielle's jaw tightened for half a second. Just that. A single muscle contraction. Then her face smoothed to professional blankness. She knelt without a word, gathering soggy papers from the floor, and something in the absolute calm of the movement made the watching staff look away. This was shame, and shame required an audience, and she was refusing to provide one. The papers were soaked through. Coffee had turned her clinical notes into abstract art. She stacked them carefully, methodically, the way someone counts medication tablets or checks a patient's pupils, work that demanded precision and nothing more. Sarah started forward to help. Whitfield waved her off with a casual hand. "Let her handle it. She's so competent." The words hung in the fluorescent light like a threat wearing a compliment's clothes. Danielle's hands didn't shake. She didn't look up. She gathered every piece of paper, every ceramic shard, and stood with the debris balanced in her hands. Coffee dripped from her fingers onto the floor. "Excuse me," she said quietly. Her voice was small. Intentionally small. A nurse's voice, trained to take up no space. She walked to the trash bin and disposed of the ruined papers, then went to the bathroom and stood for exactly 90 seconds looking at her own reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back had grey at the temples and a scar tissue line running through her left eyebrow from a blast in Marja in 2011. That woman had coordinated combat evacuations under mortar fire. That woman had extracted 3 Marines from a burning Humvee while rounds pinged off metal. That woman was currently wearing scrubs and had just knelt on a cafeteria floor like a servant. She splashed water on her hands, watching the coffee swirl down the drain, and returned to work. That evening in the physician's lounge, Whitfield told the attending staff he'd make a bet. $50 says she quits within a week, he said, swirling scotch in a glass that cost more than Danielle's monthly car payment. These older nurses, they can't handle modern medicine. Too proud. Too slow. One public humiliation and they remember why they should have retired 10 years ago. Dr. Marcus Bennett, one of the attendings, looked uncomfortable. Whitfield, that seems. Seems what? Fair. Whitfield laughed. She questioned my diagnosis in front of the whole team. She needs to understand hierarchy. But Danielle didn't quit. She showed up the next morning at 0600, her scrubs pressed, her name badge clipped to her collar with the same precision a Master Chief Petty Officer would use clipping a tactical harness. She went to the ICU. She checked the Admiral's vitals. She made notes. Her hands moved like they always did, steady as a surgical laser, the kind of steady that comes from having learned long ago that trembling was a luxury unavailable to people who held other people's lives in their palms. The betting pool collapsed. Whitfield escalated. He began flagging her for minor policy violations. Documentation filed at 10:02 instead of 10 o'clock. A medication cart left 3 feet from the designated spot. He wrote a scathing performance review citing insubordination and dangerous autonomous behavior. He called his friends on the hospital board, and he had friends, the kind of friends that came with family money and country club memberships and the assumption that rules were ornamental rather than binding. He mentioned concerns about a nurse who seemed unstable and oversteps her training. He contacted her previous employer references, asking pointed questions designed to create doubt. Did they ever have concerns about her reliability? Did she always follow chain of command? Was there ever an incident that made them uncomfortable? One afternoon he cornered her in the medication room. The space was small, lined with locked cabinets containing every drug that could kill a person if dosed wrong. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and his voice came out soft and certain, the voice of a man who had never once been told no. You think you're special, don't you? You're just another nurse. Disposable. Danielle continued counting tablets. Metoprolol. 25 milligram tabs. She counted them the way she had counted ammunition once, the way she had counted breaths in dark rooms. 1, 2, 3. Her hands didn't hesitate. Her eyes didn't track to his face. I didn't ask you a question, Whitfield said. No, doctor, she replied quietly. It wasn't agreement. It was the sound of someone choosing which battles mattered. He left. But the way he left, the way he lingered in the doorway for 2 full seconds, staring at her profile, expecting her to break, told her something important. He was running out of ammunition. Humiliation required a response, and she was giving him nothing but professional silence. His institutional power was real and significant, but it was also blunt. You could use it to get someone fired, but you couldn't use it to make them cry. You could weaponize a hospital hierarchy, but you couldn't weaponize a woman who had already survived the worst things humans could do. That evening she returned to the ICU, and the Admiral was still there. Still unconscious. Still breathing on a ventilator. The monitors showed his heart rhythm, his oxygen saturation, the slow electrical work of a body trying to continue existing. His room was dim, lit only by the glow of medical equipment, red digits, blue readouts, the soft amber of oxygen sensors. Danielle stood at his bedside and checked everything, the catheter line, the medication pump, the pressure settings on the vent. She did it the way she had checked ammunition and weapon systems and the breathing of unconscious soldiers in field hospitals where the nearest surgeon was 6 hours away by Black Hawk helicopter. She pulled out her phone to text her 16-year-old son goodnight. Saw his recruitment photo in her favorites, navy dress blues, that first salute, that first moment he understood what his mother had been all these years. The Admiral had been there when they gave that salute. He had placed his hand over his heart and honored a young man he didn't know because that young man's mother had once run toward fire instead of away from it. Danielle looked at the patient's face, lined, gray, vulnerable in unconsciousness in a way that conscious men never allowed themselves to be. She thought about the burning Humvee in Marja. She thought about impossible choices made at 0200 hours under small arms fire. She looked at the monitors and made a decision that would cost her everything. The monitors began their acceleration at 11:04 p.m. Danielle was 2 rooms down when the beeping changed pitch, not the steady rhythm of a sleeping patient, but the irregular staccato of a heart losing its argument with time. She moved without hurrying, without the panic that made other nurses' footsteps heavy. The Admiral's blood pressure had dropped from 118 systolic to 94. His heart rate climbed from 72 to 118, as if the organ itself knew it was drowning. The pulse oximetry drifted downward like a stone through water. 89%. 87%. She checked the 4 lines, checked the monitor leads, ran the numbers in her head with the same precision she'd used to coordinate medevac flights over Helmand Province 8 years ago. Pain is data. Rhythm is information. Numbers don't lie. She found Dr. Whitfield in the physician's lounge at 11:17 p.m., feet up on the desk, phone in one hand, coffee in the other. The coffee smelled like it had been sitting for 2 hours. He didn't look up. "The Admiral's vitals are destabilizing," Danielle said. Her voice remained level, clinical. No urgency. No tremor. Blood pressure trending down. Heart rate climbing. "I'm concerned about." Concerned. Whitfield set the phone down slowly, as if she'd interrupted something important. His smile had teeth. "You're concerned? That's adorable, Ross." He's 73 years old, septic, and frankly, we're prolonging the inevitable. The family's been briefed. Comfort care protocol is already in place. His pupils were equal 20 minutes ago. Now the left is sluggish. Danielle kept her hand steady at her sides. That suggests increased intracranial pressure, which doesn't align with his presenting symptoms. His breathing pattern changed in the last hour, shallower, more rapid. He's not deteriorating from sepsis. Something else is happening. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He stood, buttoned his white coat with deliberate precision, and moved to face her with the slow confidence of a man who'd never been told no by someone who couldn't destroy him in return. "Here's what I know," he said, each word a small knife. "I have a medical degree from Duke. I have 32 years of critical care experience. I have the trust of this hospital's board. And you have a high school diploma, a licensing exam you passed on your 3rd attempt, and a very short memory regarding your place in this hierarchy." He stepped closer. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop second-guessing my clinical judgment. You're going to monitor the Admiral with the protocol I established. And if he deteriorates further, you're going to call time of death when I tell you to. Are we clear?" "Yes, Doctor," Danielle said. He walked past her toward the ICU, his scrubs rustling like wind through dry grass. She followed 2 steps behind, the invisible distance that separated them like a chasm. By 2:06 a.m., the Admiral's blood pressure was 68/40. His heart rate had climbed to 142, and the rhythm on the monitor had begun to disintegrate into something closer to fibrillation. The pulsus paradoxus, the strange dip in blood pressure that came with each breath, told Danielle everything she needed to know. The heart was filling with fluid. The fluid was compressing the cardiac chambers. The chambers could no longer pump. Tamponade. She had seen this once before, in a forward operating base near Marja, in a field hospital that smelled like diesel fuel and copper. A Humvee had hit an IED. The driver had made it to the surgical tent with a penetrating chest wound and 73 seconds of useful consciousness. The attending surgeon, a captain with shaking hands and 4 years of experience, had frozen. The driver's wife was back home in North Carolina, pregnant with a daughter she'd never meet. Danielle had taken the scalpel. She'd opened the chest. She'd controlled the bleeding. The driver had lived. That day, nobody asked questions. That day, the rank on her collar meant something. The on-call attending physician, Dr. Morrison, arrived at 2:11 a.m. because the monitors screamed his name across the hospital. He was competent but cautious, the kind of doctor who read the book before attempting anything the book didn't recommend. He started CPR at 2:13. By 2:16, the Admiral's pupils had fixed and dilated. The monitor showed what doctors called a dying rhythm, the heart making final electrical impulses, the brain already accepting defeat. "Call it," Morrison said. "We can't fix cardiac tamponade without cardiac surgery, and this patient isn't surviving transport to the OR." The code nurse glanced at the clock. "Time of death?" "No," Danielle said. The room froze. Monitors beeped into the sudden silence. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song. Morrison turned to her, his face a map of confusion and professional offense. "Nurse Ross, he's. Give me 5 minutes." Danielle was already moving, pulling the emergency procedure kit from the crash cart with hands that knew exactly where every instrument lived. 5 minutes. Then you can chart whatever you want." Morrison stepped toward her, his voice dropping into the tone reserved for insubordinate staff. "You're not authorized to." She locked the ICU door. The sound of the electronic lock engaging was like a gunshot in a small room. Morrison pressed his face to the glass window, his mouth moving, words she couldn't hear and didn't need to. She'd already erased him. Erased the hospital. Erased everything except the Admiral's chest and the pressure in his pericardium and the needle that would drain his heart of the fluid that was killing him. Pericardiocentesis. 17 letters. 1 procedure. She'd done it in field hospitals under small arms fire, done it in darkness with nothing but a penlight and muscle memory, done it when failure meant someone's son wouldn't come home to North Carolina. She positioned the needle at the xiphoid process, the landmark where the ribs met, right at the angle where the pericardium opened like a door. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd trained for 10,000 hours in situations that didn't allow for trembling. She aspirated dark blood, old blood, stagnant blood, blood the heart couldn't pump anymore because there was no room. The monitor showed immediate response. The pressure released. The chambers could expand. The electrical impulses strengthened. She drained 200 milliliters. The color of the fluid told her everything, not fresh blood, not infection, but old cardiac damage finally betraying the Admiral's heart. By 2:24 a.m., the rhythm was stable. Blood pressure had climbed to 86/52. Respirations began on their own. Danielle unlocked the door. Morrison stared at the Admiral's monitor, then at her, then back at the monitor. The other staff members were frozen in poses of medical bewilderment. The code nurse was still holding the pen over the time of death line. "Continue monitoring," Danielle said. Her voice was different now. Quieter. The voice of someone who directed traffic during combat evacuations. "I want labs every 2 hours. Call if the rhythm becomes irregular again. He needs cardiology consultation at 0600 hours." She documented the procedure with clinical precision, each notation exact, needle insertion depth, fluid color, volume drained, patient response. Then she sat at the bedside and waited for the Admiral to wake. He opened his eyes at 3:02 a.m. Confusion first, the standard response of someone pulled back from the edge of a cliff they didn't know they'd been standing on. Then understanding. Then the slow recognition that he was still alive, that someone had chosen to stand alone in a locked room and drain his heart rather than fill out a death certificate. What happened? His voice was the whisper of someone whose body had forgotten how to use volume. "Cardiac tamponade," Danielle said. "Fluid around the heart. We drained it." "We?" He studied her face. "That would be you." She didn't answer. She checked his vitals instead, her movements flowing from one gesture to the next like water finding the shape of a vessel. At 3:52 a.m., Morrison called Dr. Whitfield. At 4:03 a.m., Whitfield arrived at the hospital, walked directly to the ICU, and saw the Admiral, alive, conscious, with a procedure note in his file that bore Danielle's signature and a procedure he knew she had no legal authority to perform. The blood drained from his face in stages, like the ocean pulling back before a tsunami. He stepped into the hallway. His hands were shaking, but not from gratitude. He saw what she was, not just a nurse who'd overstepped, but someone who'd challenged the institutional order that protected him. Someone who'd demonstrated competence outside the hierarchy. Someone who'd proven that the hospital's rules didn't apply to her because she operated in a world where rules were written by people with far more power than a hospital board. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to the hospital board chairman at 4:07 a.m., a conversation that began with "We have a credentialing crisis" and ended with "I'm concerned she's a serious liability." The second was to the credentialing office, where he described a nurse who'd performed a surgical procedure without authorization, violated scope of practice, and endangered a patient's life. The third was to an outside investigator named Patricia Langer, who specialized in medical licensing violations and whose opinions carried weight in disciplinary hearings. By 5:33 a.m., formal proceedings against Danielle Ross had begun. By 6:06 a.m., she was being asked to surrender her access badge pending the investigation. By 6:45 a.m., Cedar Creek Medical's general counsel was reviewing whether to recommend termination or refer the matter to the state nursing board for license revocation. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Whitfield arrived at the ICU at 6:22 a.m., still in yesterday's clothes, his tie loosened and his face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from making phone calls at 3 in the morning. He expected to see a corpse. Instead, he found the Admiral awake, pale, weak, but undeniably alive, with Danielle standing beside the bed adjusting the pericardial drain with the calm precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The monitor showed stable sinus rhythm. O2 sat at 96%. Blood pressure climbing back toward normal. Whitfield's jaw tightened. Not because the Admiral lived. Because he knew exactly who had made that happen, and it wasn't him. He'd spent the last 3 hours calling board members. The hospital's chief medical officer picked up at 2:15 a.m. She performed a procedure she's not credentialed for, Whitfield had said into the darkness of his car in the hospital parking lot. Pericardiocentesis without physician oversight. She locked medical staff out of the room during a code. "We're looking at patient endangerment, scope violation, and potential criminal negligence." The CMO had listened, had asked questions, had promised to convene an emergency committee. Whitfield had also called a private investigator he knew, a man who specialized in credential fraud investigations, and given him Danielle's name. "I need her employment history verified," he'd said. "Cross-reference her previous hospitals. Check her certifications against the state board database. I have a feeling this woman isn't who she claims to be." By 4 a.m., he'd contacted her 3 previous employers. 2 of them had no record of her working there at all. The third provided only minimal information, dates of employment, nothing more. No references would talk. It was like trying to grab smoke. Which, Whitfield realized, was exactly the point. A woman didn't disappear from 5 years of your life without help. A woman didn't have a completely scrubbed professional history unless someone had scrubbed it for her. And that meant there was something to find. Something disqualifying. Something that would explain how a nurse knew enough surgical technique to perform an emergency pericardiocentesis like she'd been trained by the military itself. At 7:48 a.m., Whitfield sat in the hospital administrator's office with his documentation spread across the table like an indictment. The chief administrator, Margaret Chen, read through the performance reviews he'd written, each one carefully designed to look legitimate, each one building a case. Policy violations. Insubordination. Questionable judgment. By the 5th page, Chen's expression had shifted from curious to grave. The outside investigator, a thin man named Pierce with the demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years finding dirt, nodded along while taking notes. Whitfield had invited him specifically. Pierce worked for the hospital's malpractice insurance carrier. If there was a liability issue, Pierce would find it, and legally, the hospital could document everything he found. "We need to bring her in," Chen said, reaching for her phone. Danielle was called from the Admiral's room at 8:15 a.m. A charge nurse delivered the message, "Administrator Chen wants to see you in the conference room. Now." No elaboration. Danielle knew. She'd seen Whitfield arrive. She'd watched him move through the hospital with the controlled urgency of a man executing a plan. She knew what the next 8 hours would bring because she'd seen institutional power deployed like this before, not in hospitals, but in military courtrooms, in classified debrief rooms, in the kinds of places where people's lives got rewritten by people with authority and an agenda. She took the elevator to the administrative floor. Her scrubs were still damp with sweat from the night shift. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her hands, steady as surgical steel, didn't shake when she opened the conference room door. Chen, Whitfield, the investigator Pierce, and the hospital's general counsel were already seated. Whitfield had arranged them strategically, himself and Pierce on one side, the counsel on the other, Chen at the head of the table. The body language of a firing squad dressed in business casual. "Please sit, Danielle," Chen said, gesturing to the empty chair. Danielle Saturday. Her posture remained perfect. Her eyes moved from face to face, cataloguing expressions like threat assessments. Whitfield didn't waste time. "Last night, you performed an emergency pericardiocentesis on Admiral Harrison without physician authorization, without proper credentialing, and without following hospital protocol. You locked the ICU door during a code blue, preventing medical staff from entering. You essentially took control of a medical crisis without any legal authority to do so." He slid a document across the table. "These are the facts as we understand them." "The patient was dead," Danielle said. Her voice was quiet. "Steady." Attending physician called it. "Irrelevant," Pierce interjected, his pen moving across his notepad. "The question isn't whether the intervention was successful. The question is whether you had the credentials and authorization to perform it." Chen leaned forward. "Danielle, we've reviewed your personnel file. Your certification shows ACLS and BLS, which is standard for nursing. Nothing in your record indicates training in invasive cardiac procedures. Can you explain your medical background?" Danielle could have lied. She could have claimed a special certification course, a workshop, advanced training. Instead, she said nothing for 3 seconds. The silence in the room felt like pressure. "I was trained," she said finally. The past tense was deliberate. Whitfield pounced. "Trained where? By whom? Under what circumstances? Your employment history shows gaps we can't account for. One of your previous employers has no record of you ever working there. Another won't provide references. It's as if you've been erased from your own career." She had been. Deliberately. By military order. But she said nothing. Pierce opened a folder. "I've been investigating your credentials for the last 6 hours. What I've found is deeply concerning. Your nursing degree is legitimate, that checks out. Your state license is current. But your work history from 2007 to 2019 is essentially non-existent in any civilian database. No W-2s from major hospitals. No malpractice insurance. No references willing to comment. For a woman who claims to be a nurse, you've left almost no professional footprint." The general counsel, a woman named Hartwell, adjusted her glasses. "The hospital's malpractice insurance requires full transparency regarding employee training and background. Gaps like this," she gestured to Pierce's file, "create significant liability." Chen's voice had gone quiet. "Danielle, we need to know the truth. Where were you? What were you doing? Why is there such a significant gap in your employment record?" Danielle could have told them. Could have explained that she'd been on active duty as a combat medic, treating casualties in Marja province under her call sign Lighthouse 1, under military orders that still held some legal weight, under a classified designation that meant she was supposed to be untraceable. She could have shown them the service record her son kept in a safe deposit box, a document with military seals that would have changed everything in that room instantly. Instead, she sat perfectly still. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the discipline of someone who'd learned that the truth, weaponized by people like Whitfield, could destroy more than bullets ever could. "I don't have authorization to discuss that portion of my background," she said. 10 words. No more. Whitfield smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just been handed everything he needed. "Then we're at an impasse," he said. "The hospital cannot employ a nurse with an unexplained employment history and demonstrated willingness to practice beyond her scope. We also cannot ignore the liability exposure created by last night's incident." He turned to Chen. "I recommend immediate suspension pending full investigation, with termination as the likely outcome." Pierce nodded. "The insurance carrier will need a complete statement for their records. We'll also be referring this to the State Nursing Board for credential review." Chen closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked older. "Danielle, we're placing you on immediate suspension effective now. Your security badge will be deactivated. We'll need your hospital ID and access cards. An investigation will proceed over the next 30 days. Until then, you're not to enter the facility or contact patients." The General Counsel slid a document across the table. "This is your termination notice. It cites patient endangerment, practicing beyond your scope of practice, and credential discrepancies as grounds for immediate dismissal. You'll receive your final paycheck within 5 business days." Danielle took the document. She read it carefully, her eyes moving across the words with the methodical precision she'd learned from reading after-action reports and classified briefs. Every word was designed to justify Whitfield's decision. Every sentence built a case. They'd been thorough. She respected that, even as the noose tightened. "You'll need to speak with HR about your health insurance and retirement benefits," Hartwell added, not quite meeting her eyes. It was 8:53 a.m. By 6:15 p.m., a security guard, a younger man named Davis who'd never spoken to her but who'd seen her work night shifts for 18 months, walked her to the parking lot. Her locker had been emptied into a cardboard box. Family photos. A water bottle with the Navy insignia still faintly visible despite the wear. Trauma shears with her initials engraved on them. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, a pair of worn combat boots. Green canvas. Cracked leather. Laces frayed from 18 years of use across 3 continents. The soles were thin enough that you could feel rocks through them. The heels were scuffed from 1,000 patrols through Helmand province. They carried the dust of Marja still, ground into the seams where it would never fully wash out. No one asked about those boots. No one asked why a hospital nurse kept military-grade footwear in her locker. No one connected the dots because nobody was looking at the real picture. Davis didn't speak as he handed her the box. His jaw was tight. He was ex-army, she'd learned during a hallway conversation 3 months ago. He knew what silent service records meant. He knew what disappeared years meant. He probably knew exactly who she'd been, or at least understood the category of person she belonged to. But he said nothing. Professional courtesy. The respect of people who'd learned that some stories don't get told and some silences are louder than screaming. At 2:13 a.m., Danielle sat in a corner booth at Mel's Diner on Victory Drive. The fluorescent lights above her head hummed with the kind of persistent drone that made your bones ache after hours of listening to it. Her coffee had gone cold 40 minutes ago. The cup left a ring on the laminate table. She stared at her reflection in the window, a woman in her mid-50s with grey threading through her dark hair, lines around her eyes from squinting into desert sun and into the faces of dying soldiers, hands that looked older than the rest of her because of the scar tissue and the calluses that never quite faded. She thought about the night the extraction team came to pull her out of the field. October 2019. Her unit had taken casualties. She'd spent 14 hours in a forward operating base treating wounds that shouldn't have been survivable, watching the blood drain from a good man's face, doing everything right and watching him die anyway. The colonel had pulled her aside afterward, handed her a sealed envelope with military letterhead. "Your service record is being classified retroactively," he'd said. "You'll receive a civilian discharge, full benefits, but your years of active service are going to be removed from your employment history for security purposes. You never served. You never were in Marja. You never existed in any official capacity. You're going to go home, and you're going to become a nurse, and you're going to live a quiet life. That's an order, Master Chief." She'd done exactly that. Gotten her nursing degree. Started at Cedar Creek. Kept her mouth shut. Wore her scrubs and her composure like armor. And she'd been good at it, genuinely good, not pretending good. She'd cared for patients the way she'd cared for wounded Marines, with the kind of attention to detail that comes from knowing that tiny mistakes kill people. She'd saved Admiral Harrison's life twice. Once in Marja when she'd pulled him burning from a Humvee. Again last night when she'd placed a needle between his ribs and let the fluid out so his heart could beat again. Both times, she'd done it without hesitation, without calculation, without thinking about what it would cost her. Her phone buzzed at 3:14 a.m. A text from her son. "Mom? You okay? Haven't heard from you since your shift." She stared at the message. How did you tell your 16-year-old that the hospital had fired you? How did you explain that doing the right thing sometimes meant losing everything? How did you tell him that the medals folded in his closet, the one she'd told him his father had earned, which was technically true but not quite the whole story, meant his mother had been something else, something darker, something that official records no longer acknowledged? She didn't respond. She put her phone on the table. She wrapped her hands around the cold coffee cup and wondered if disappearing after Marja had been worth it. If 18 months of helping people breathe and healing wounds and checking vitals on unconscious admirals was worth a single word from a man like Whitfield. If keeping her silence, honoring her orders, accepting erasure in exchange for another life, if all of that had been the right choice when there were still cowards like Whitfield holding power over people who actually gave a damn. The rain started at 3:13 a.m. It hammered the diner windows like artillery. The sound was exactly what she needed to hear. The investigator Whitfield had hired arrived at Cedar Creek Medical on a Tuesday morning with a folder that wasn't about Danielle Ross. It was about him. The outside firm, the one his money had supposed to buy, had done what outside firms do when they actually investigate. They looked everywhere. They found the first patient death in 2019, buried under a nursing error notation that didn't match the actual chart sequence. They found the second death in 2021, the medication order Whitfield had backdated by 4 hours, the timestamp correction that someone had tried to hide in the hospital's legacy system. They found the third death in 2022, the family who had settled quietly, the settlement agreement that came with an NDA worth $200,000 and Whitfield's personal guarantee of silence. 3 patients. 3 families. 3 deaths that Whitfield had attributed to nursing negligence when the evidence showed something else entirely, a physician who prescribed the wrong drug at the wrong concentration and then altered the documentation to protect himself. The hospital board convened on Wednesday afternoon in the executive conference room on the 4th floor. The windows overlooked Forsyth Park, where tourists took photographs of the fountain, and nobody down there knew that a man's entire career was collapsing 17 stories above them. The investigator presented his findings with the precision of someone who had done this before. Patient 1, Mr. James Caldwell, 63, admitted for acute pancreatitis. Whitfield ordered 2 milligrams of morphine. The standard dose was 1 milligram. The pharmacy called to verify. Whitfield insisted. The nurse administered what the physician ordered. Mr. Caldwell went into respiratory depression. Whitfield's note, nursing staff failed to monitor respiratory status adequately. But the cardiac monitor showed continuous monitoring. The nursing note showed vitals checked every 15 minutes. Mr. Caldwell's death certificate listed complications of opioid toxicity. Whitfield's amended note, filed 2 weeks later, shifted blame entirely. Patient 2, Margaret Torres, 58, septic shock from an infected dialysis line. Whitfield prescribed an antibiotic that she'd had a documented allergy to. The pharmacy flagged it. Whitfield overrode the flag with a note, patient tolerance has likely improved. It hadn't. Ms. Torres seized. Whitfield's chart notation, revised after her death, indicated the nursing staff had failed to report the allergic reaction quickly enough. The actual timeline showed the nursing staff had reported it immediately. The physician had been unavailable for 93 minutes. Patient 3, David Chen, 41, postoperative day 2 from elective spinal fusion. Whitfield ordered a sedative at a dose meant for geriatric patients in end-of-life care. A nurse questioned the order. Whitfield signed off anyway. A different nurse administered it. Mr. Chen never woke up. His family sued. The settlement agreement, now exposed, had included a clause requiring the hospital to provide Whitfield with a written defense against any future malpractice claims arising from his care of Mr. Chen. The hospital had complied. The board chairman, Marcus Holbrook, the same man who had taken Whitfield's 2 a.m. phone call about removing Danielle Ross from the schedule, set down the investigator's report and looked at Whitfield across the mahogany table as if seeing him for the first time. "Do you have anything to say?" Holbrook asked. Whitfield's voice came out like a man stepping off a cliff and realizing too late that there was no ground below. Those cases were complex. Medicine is interpretive. The families were compensated. With hospital money, Holbrook said quietly. With money our insurance company was unaware they should be covering because the incident reports you filed were fraudulent. He turned to the other board members. To his left, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, Chief of Staff. To his right, Linda Vasquez, the hospital's legal counsel. Neither of them looked at Whitfield. The question now is whether we report this to the Georgia Medical Board or let the family's attorneys do it. The answer came 2 hours later when Vasquez made the call. By Thursday morning, the Savannah Morning News had the story. The headline ran front page, "Prominent Savannah physician accused of falsifying medical records, 3 deaths under investigation." The article included statements from the family's attorney. It included the settlement agreements. It included a quote from one of the families, "We thought our loved one simply died. Now we're learning the physician lied about what happened." By Friday, reporters were calling every major hospital system in Georgia asking if they'd ever employed Dr. Whitfield. The answer was yes. Emory University in Atlanta had terminated his privileges in 2018 for what they'd called documentation discrepancies. Medical College of Georgia had suspended him in 2019 pending an investigation that was still technically open. Mercer University had hired him for 6 months in 2020 and let his contract expire without renewal. The pattern emerged like a scar you finally notice because someone else pointed it out, a physician moving from institution to institution, each time leaving behind questions that got buried, each time landing somewhere new where his credentials looked good enough and nobody checked closely enough. The references Whitfield had called to destroy Danielle's reputation now spoke to investigators, and their recollection of those conversations changed dramatically. Dr. Whitfield was asking very leading questions, one of them told the hospital's legal team. He seemed to have already decided something was wrong and was trying to get me to confirm it. At the time I didn't think much about it, but now. He trailed off. Another reference said simply, "I wish I'd asked him why he was asking." The physicians who had laughed when Whitfield dropped Danielle's tray in the cafeteria now told HR investigators that they'd thought it was inappropriate but hadn't wanted to get involved. One of them, Dr. Robert Simons, the cardiologist who had been standing 3 feet away when Whitfield forced her to kneel and gather papers from the floor, sent an email to the hospital administrator, "I witnessed conduct toward a nursing staff member that I now understand was part of a larger pattern of retaliation. I should have reported it then. I'm reporting it now." On Monday of the following week, the hospital placed Dr. Whitfield on immediate administrative leave pending criminal investigation. His privileges were suspended. His malpractice insurance carrier, having reviewed the investigator's report and the 3 settlement agreements, opened their own inquiry and declined to defend him in the civil suits now being filed by the Chen family and the Caldwell estate. The Torres family's case had been settled with confidentiality, but their attorney was cooperating with the state investigation anyway. By Wednesday, the Georgia Medical Board issued an emergency suspension of Whitfield's medical license, the kind of suspension that doesn't wait for a hearing, the kind that tells the world something is catastrophically wrong. The local news ran footage of Whitfield leaving the hospital, his head down, his jaw clenched like a man trying not to break, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor of the lobby as he walked past the very nurses he'd tried to destroy. 3 attorneys turned down his case within the first 48 hours. The 4th one he finally reached agreed to take it but quoted a retainer of $75,000, non-refundable, and that was just for the medical board hearing. Whitfield's career savings, once substantial, began evaporating into legal fees like water on hot asphalt. His wife, who had smiled at hospital galas and believed his version of events, stopped smiling when she saw the settlement agreements. She stopped speaking to him entirely by Thursday. She moved in with her sister in Atlanta and called a divorce attorney on Friday. The country club called him personally to say that his membership would be suspended pending investigation, which was a courtesy that meant it was permanent. The house in Forsyth Heights, mortgaged to a degree that his malpractice insurance had been covering, suddenly required him to actually pay the mortgage on a suspended physician's salary, which was zero. Meanwhile, the hospital administrator called Danielle Ross at home on a Tuesday evening. Her voice on the phone was steady, professional, with no trace of the shame that Cedar Creek Medical was finally beginning to feel. "We want to offer you full reinstatement," the administrator said. "Back pay, of course. A formal apology in your personnel file. And we'd like to discuss a new position, if you're interested." Danielle listened to the offer. She considered the arithmetic of it, the 18 months of unemployment, the interviews at smaller hospitals where they'd always seemed to know she'd been fired from Cedar Creek, the shift work at an urgent care center in Charleston where she'd spent 6 months seeing patients with sprained ankles and upper respiratory infections, the small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where the elevator didn't work half the time. She considered what it would cost to say no. What it would cost to say yes. "I want to come back," she said finally. "But not as a nurse. Not anymore." There was a pause on the line. "What do you mean?" "I want to rebuild how this hospital treats people who see something wrong and speak up," Danielle said. Her voice had dropped an octave since the day she was fired. It was the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore everything to gain. "I want protocols. Real ones. Not suggestions. Not guidelines that physicians can override. Systems where a patient advocate can escalate concerns directly to the board without going through a chain of command that includes the person they're concerned about. And I want to hire people who know what it costs to speak up under pressure, people who have actually done it." "You're talking about restructuring the entire ER authority model," the administrator said. "I'm talking about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen again," Danielle replied. "And making sure what happened to Mr. Caldwell and Ms. Torres and Mr. Chen actually gets prevented the next time, instead of covered up." The board approved it within 72 hours. Desperate to contain the damage, grateful to have something that looked like accountability, they offered Danielle the position of Director of Emergency Medicine at Cedar Creek Medical. 6 months later, she sat in a corner office on the 5th floor with her name on the door, Danielle Ross, Director of Emergency Medicine, and the worn combat boots from her hospital locker on a shelf beside a framed photograph of her son in his Navy dress blues, recently promoted to Petty Officer First Class. The Admiral, discharged 3 months prior, had visited the hospital to thank her personally. He'd brought a letter of commendation for her personnel file and sat in her office for 20 minutes, saying very little, just present. When he left, he'd placed his hand on her shoulder and said only, "Your son was right to be proud." The words had landed like a salute. Danielle had spent those 6 months rebuilding how Cedar Creek Medical worked. She'd hired 3 former combat medics into specialized trauma roles, people who understood under-pressure decision-making because they'd done it. She'd implemented a system where nurses had direct escalation authority to the Patient Safety Board, bypassing the physician hierarchy entirely. She'd created peer review protocols that included mandatory transparency. Every significant decision by every physician was logged, reviewed, and discussed. She'd created retaliation protections with real teeth, not suggestions, not policies, but institutional guarantees that a nurse who spoke up couldn't be quietly transferred, couldn't have their hours cut, couldn't be isolated. The first time a physician tried to punish a nurse for questioning a medication order, the hospital's new protocols caught it immediately. That physician got a 1-week suspension and mandatory re-education. The message was clear, the old system was dead. One afternoon, driving past a strip mall on the edge of Savannah near the industrial district, Danielle saw him. Dr. Whitfield sat at a folding table in front of an insurance agency window, brochures stacked neatly in front of him, talking to a woman who was already backing away, shaking her head. He'd lost weight. His suit was off the rack, not custom. The line of his jaw, once confident, now sagged with the weight of a man learning that his degree and his diplomas and his carefully constructed reputation meant nothing once they were gone. He glanced up as her car passed, and for a moment their eyes met. Danielle didn't stop. She didn't feel triumph, didn't feel satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that the system was slightly better than it was because he was no longer in it. That evening, she mentored a young nurse, Maria Chen, no relation to the David Chen from the case, but the universe had its humor, who had been publicly corrected by an attending physician for questioning a medication order. "You did the right thing," Danielle said quietly, sitting in her office as the Savannah sun dropped low over the hospital. "Advocating for that patient. Speaking up. Don't let anyone make you small for being competent." Maria's eyes drifted to the boots on the shelf. "What's the story with those?" she asked. Danielle picked one up, ran her thumb over the scarred leather, the worn places where sand from Helm and Province had left permanent marks. "These remind me that the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. And that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's strategy." But speaking up, she looked at Maria directly. "That takes a different kind of courage. The kind that doesn't show in your personnel file but shows every time you walk into a room with integrity still intact." She set the boot back carefully on the shelf. "Never apologize for knowing better. Just stay ready to prove it." Through her office window, the sun finished its descent, and the hospital lights came on floor by floor, casting warm light across the city. Danielle Ross, Master Chief Petty Officer, combat veteran, hidden identity made real, began reviewing the files for tomorrow's shift. Her hands were steady. Her purpose was clear. The system she'd been forced to rebuild wasn't perfect, but it was better. And tomorrow, someone would speak up under pressure and know that the institution would have their back. Because she'd made certain it would. Hit that like button now. And I need to know, would you have revealed your identity, or stayed invisible? Drop your answer below. Subscribe so you never miss a story.